Our next speaker is Tom Harvey. Tom is the director of the Nonprofit Excellence Program at Notre Dame, and that includes a graduate degree in nonprofit management. Tom has quite a history of social action. He was the senior vice president of the Alliance for Children and Families. He was the president and CEO of Catholic Charities USA. Tom is an authority on NGO governance and has a 2009 book of that title. Tom will outline how the social benefits sector has developed as an integral part of the global economy with an eye toward religious organizations. Tom.
And Tom is old enough not to use PowerPoints. I have distributed a goldenrod summary of my remarks, and I like to do that so that people can feel comfortable that they don't have to take notes and can have some of the references. Let me just say at the beginning that I use the term social benefit sector because I'm really speaking from the bias of the safety net social services within a developed country like the United States. We tend not to use the term NGO, non-governmental organization. We usually use the term nonprofit. But that's really a term of tax policy in the United States, and I don't think it represents what the nonprofit sector should be. We don't really have a good word. We use independent sector, we use voluntary sector, but I think social benefit at least tries to craft that we are here to serve the human community. And since the human community represents a lot of different interests, I think that term is, by its own essence, collaborative, relational, and I'm going to try to bring that out in my remarks. Father Peter John began with a biblical reference. If I were to take one, I wouldn't take Lazarus, I would take Nicodemus and say, now you can dismiss your servant in peace. I have seen great promise, great hope, because of the United Nations accent on this human development through the Millennium Project. It stands in such contrast to so much of the laissez-faire and individual economic development that has said so much about the human condition, but is often unanalyzed in terms of that relationship. And so I am very hopeful because of what this represents. I also am cautious. I don't bring an expectation that it's going to solve all the problems in the world. I think Dean Wu alluded to that last night. We have 6,000 corporations involved out of 78,000 that are active throughout the world in the economy. So to craft my remarks in some kind of a contained way, I want to take the risk of going to the highest level of reflection from history. If you really think about it, for 5,000 years of recorded history, the basis of wealth was land. We organized almost all society on all continents around that. We fought wars over that. We had laws that would contain people from moving from one place to the other because the more hands and legs and bodies, the more productivity. So in a sense, the modern world, not just wealth and poverty, but almost all aspects of our living really date to the axial shift that was represented by the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In a 15-minute reflection, you can't go into all the details, and I know the Industrial Revolution is a movement. It began in some places, it's only being discovered in others. In some places like the United States, we can say that's last year's agenda, we're the information age, we're the organization age. But in point of fact, it was the Industrial Revolution that crafted modern civilization that we're still dealing with. As religion, I would suggest that the Industrial Revolution has more to do around the church's teaching or inability to cope with things like marriage and elderliness than any religious value that would come from the dialogue between Protestant and Catholic or Catholic and other main religions of the world. Let me give some examples. The basis of change was the shift from land to capital. But if you begin to look at the impact of that, it meant work was separated from the family. In many ways, we still pretend in our teaching in the church that the father is still 10 feet from the kitchen window, and how we handle a lot of the problems of family life are reflected by that basic separation of work from the family. Historically, the fathers taught their sons through the apprentice model. Mothers taught their daughters. Craftspeople used the apprentice model to teach. Now independent schools were born. The separation of education from the family model, the communication of basic skills, and then eventually specialization that would lead to the deferring of mate selection, the forming of the bond of marriage, even the deferral of babies. All of that, even gender roles and the assignment of gender roles, are all connected to this massive economic shift that took place and is still unfolding throughout the world. Perhaps it's less tied to it, but we can even say longevity, which I represent, really was created, first through the purification of water, and then later through medical breakthroughs, whether through surgery or pharmaceutical. But the concept of longevity that is both a reward and a challenge to us in dealing with it within the human community is something that we can trace to the modern economy and the economic forces. And finally, while sometimes we look at the negative, it was also the Industrial Revolution that created leisure and the weekend and all the things that we have to learn to cope with around that. I share that because I think sometimes when you broaden the context of the discussion, you don't have to say the collaboration is the role of the safety net agencies talking to the corporations and saying, hey, you have created some of my clients. I have to deal with that on a regular level, but I think we have a power that is coming from the effect of the economy on all aspects of life. Speaking as a Catholic, I can say it took 200 or 300 years for the leadership of the Catholic Church to even understand what these economic forces were. It was only 120 years ago the Catholic social teachings were giving their birth in the encyclical Rerum Novarum. Just 27 years before that, the Pope before Leo XIII condemned almost everything modern in the Syllabus of Errors because there was no real analysis of what the impact of this new economy and economic reality was going to do to the human family. One of my concerns is that in the West, which has had a dominant role as the whole world embraces economic issues and change, has tended to separate public policy from the common good goal and have it much more represent the needs of the economic investment community and the corporations of the world. Now, that has been analyzed very carefully by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward in a book called Regulating the Poor, The Functions of Public Welfare. But even beyond that long historic course, I can give examples out of recent public policy. On February 18th, in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, there was an analysis of homelessness in New York City, one of the largest cities in the United States. In that city, there are 37,000 homeless people. Even in an educated group like this, if I were to give a quick survey and say, who do you think they are? A lot of people would respond, they are the bipolar, they are the mentally ill, they are the people with personal problems. In point of fact, 80% of all the homeless in New York City are women with children. The vast majority are children. Now, you're talking about our future workforce. Even though poverty in the United States has been reduced to about 14% of the population, over 20% of children in this country are being raised in those poverty homes. That's why Nicodemus needs the opportunity to say there's a new hope, and it's coming from the drive of things like this United Nations Millennium Project. Still, the number one cause of homelessness in New York City that's been analyzed by researchers is gentrification. Gentrification is a term that describes luxury developers taking over old neighborhoods, buying property relatively cheap, and changing the population demographics. There is a predictable ratio on how many people in those neighborhoods will become homeless. It has been stable for almost 3 decades. Has there been an investment? Yes. In some recent years, New York City, with a combination of government money, private charity, state money, and municipal money, has invested $880 million trying to resolve the problems of homelessness. They're still approaching it as a behavioral issue, to the great failure rate of us solving some of these problems, even in the developed world. So I think that's one of the main points that I wanted to share in this brief time with you today, that we need to be critical of policies that are not representing the interests of the people most affected by them. That's what the principle of subsidiarity is all about. It's very important for us to see what the impact is and to move impact in public policy away from only the impact on investors and the corporate community will be a refreshing opportunity for us to discover community in new and more creative ways. I think to bring home that issue that we tend to still see many of our social problems as not economically driven, but as behavioral, comes to a acute analysis or a comparison that is rather interesting and very easy to perceive. In 1935, the poor were the majority in this country. And if you decide you want to be poor, I recommend being poor when the majority are. It's much harder when you're part of a minority that's poor. In 1935, we crafted a piece of legislation that's one of the more enlightened pieces that has come out of our history. It's called the Social Security Act. No pejorative labeling of people. It merely says Social Security. It has a subunit that used to be called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. No stereotype. Just 30 or so years later, in 1996, when we had the so-called Welfare Reform Act, we called it the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Personal responsibility. In the 20 years before that, we went through a massive dislocation as we in the United States moved from an industrial manufacturing economy to a service economy. In the Catholic Charities movement, people who had been our donors were now becoming our clients, and we had to deal with that reality. So the second little anecdote beside the New York story one that I want to share with you comes from the statistics of my own leadership role as the head of this almost 1,000 agencies across the country. In 1982, when I became the president, Catholic Charities served about 3.5 million clients across this country. Over 3/4 of them were middle class to rich. Only 23%, one out of 4 or 5, needed food or shelter. By the time I finished my 10-year term in 1992, Catholic Charities USA members served 13.5 million clients. 64% needed food or shelter. That represented not a behavioral change of people that chose to suddenly not want to work. It was an economic dislocation of massive proportion because people whose skills were now no longer aligned with the new economy. And it's one of the things I've been suspicious of outcome measures because we in the welfare system, if you will, were given $8 per unemployed person in census tracts to provide food relief, $8 per person, when their needs were basically new opportunities in training, new opportunities in accessing the jobs that were now available as opposed to those that weren't. And it was especially the religious community that was asked to do this because we have church basements that are empty and access to volunteers, so we could produce at 2% what other parts of the economy could not do. And so I speak from that bias, but I think anything that can broaden the debate to have all the stakeholders in what we call the common good represented is surely going to lead us to a world that is more human and more welcoming and more successful across the board. Last night, Dean Wu noted, even though we've had great progress in developed countries and in the United States, we still have a widening gap between wealth and poverty, between the richest and the poorest. That really is a challenge to the sense of community that makes up this nation and has given us a great blessing in the last 100 years. I only hope and pray that the United Nations Millennium Project really becomes the catalyst for a new way of analyzing, a new way of collaborating, and a new way of bringing all of us to a world that surely is what religion should be all about. Thank you very much.